In the last few weeks, we've talked a bit about head carriage, we've talked a lot about feet, talked a little bit about the hips, particularly in terms of that flexion that folds slightly forward from the hip crease that does a lot to control the center of gravity. We haven't talked too much about pelvic tilt, partially because that's one of the more challenging things to discuss at the beginning. But it's a big part of Tai Chi posture. And we want to think of it to some degree coming from that slight flexion. So as I fold forward from the hips, remembering that as I do that, the head is floating back a little bit, chin comes back, the crown lifts. It gives me opportunity to start to drop the back of the hip bones down. So the base of the spine, the sacrum, the back of the hip bones, right? Or even think of dropping the tailbone down under the body, however you want to think about it. But it's all essentially what we call posterior pelvic tilt. And one thing we notice it doing right away is the normal curve in the low back starts to flatten out. And this is a big difference between normal everyday posture and Tai Chi posture. The big challenge initially is often that if I think of tucking the tailbone under, it tends to push that hip crease forward and flatten it out. So it takes away the flexion. So initially people are often a little confused. They think, oh, well, if I flex from my hips, my backside's sticking out. Or if I tuck my tailbone under, then it pushes my hips forward. But those are actually two separate ranges of motion. So I want to start again, like I said, with the hip flexion, which means my knees are also a little bent. And I even feel that down in my ankles, as if it's tilting my whole body forward a little bit, like that skiing posture. Feeling how that gives me an opportunity to start to relax and lengthen the back. So if the crown is lifting, the crown being a little bit to the rear of the head, and I can start to drop the tailbone under and feel that instead of that being opposed to feeling the crease or fold in front, hip flexion, that it's that hip flexion that makes it a little easier to drop the tailbone under without a lot of muscular effort. So I'm not tensing my buttocks, my abs, right, to pull that in. It feels much more like a relaxation and a release down in Chinese, song, right, to loosen. And it should feel like it loosens the lower back quite a bit. It even helps loosen the hips, makes it feel as if my weight can sink very freely down through this whole area, from the waist, down through the hips, into the legs, and eventually down through the feet. As I start to feel that, particularly the back of the hips loosening and sinking, I can think the same about the shoulder blades, sinking down toward the middle of my back a little bit. So the shoulders never hang forward on the body. And that should make my weight feel really even toe to heel. Now, a simple exercise I can do within this posture is just to rock the weight forward and back. Again, feeling the feet spreading out a little bit when I'm about 70% forward, still 30% in the heel. And then as I sit back to the heels, only 70% of my weight. So the whole front of the foot, the toes stay down. And I may feel as if the whole foot, not just the toes, the whole sole of the foot's grabbing the floor a little bit. And I'm trying to just maintain this same body posture within that weight shift. Particularly keeping that posterior pelvic tilt. Right. Let's see which way should I go? I'll step back a little bit. So you can see the line on my back against the light curtains. Right. So here's a deeper curve. And that's normal posture. It's not like we're trying to erase that all the time. Right? But for Tai Chi posture, we find that pelvic tilt, right? And you can see how the lower back is flattening out gently. Again, without holding a lot of tension in the local muscles. We can also do a little weight shift side to side, about 70% of the weight again, which means 30% is left in the lighter foot and in the whole foot. We never let that foot roll in. And in fact, it's that dropping of the tailbone and loosening of the lower back and the hip that helps keep that foot planted when the weight's coming off of it. So the little toe stays down, that whole side of the foot. So it's very helpful to really put a little more attention to the lighter leg in the sense of releasing tension and releasing the weight down through that hip on the lighter side, through the leg, and feeling how the foot stays anchored. That'll tend to take care of the heavy side. The heavy side doesn't actually need as much attention. Once you have the feeling, then you can pay attention to both at the same time and feel the relationship between them. Feel that lengthening, opening, and releasing, and the kind of consolidation and the firming up of the other side. And that's it, yin-yang relationship. Heavy and light. Opening, lengthening versus consolidating. I may be even able to feel that action up through the hips into the abdomen and into the lower back area. It's another thing that pelvic tilt does for me is it makes the low back area a little more active, makes it easier to feel what's happening there. And I want to think of everything from the sole of my foot up through my lower back, at the very least, to be one long chain of support. And so anything that's happening in the foot is happening up in the hip, in the abdomen, in the low back area, and I should be able to feel that. Sensation might be very subtle at first. So we went forward and back, side to side, and now we can make a little circle. And every part of both feet stays anchored the whole time. And while it's natural to sort of put my attention to the heavy area, trying to bring it to the light side is really useful. And at the very least, it helps keep the whole in my field of attention. So when 70% of the weight is on one leg, that 30% on the other, right, acts as a kind of anchor and keeps the weighted side very well aligned. So my hip's right over my heel, my knee is right over the instep of my foot. The hip never sways out to the side. Circle one direction, circle the other way. And with this posture, just like I'm not tensing anything, right, significantly, right? There's a little tension everywhere, but I'm not like bearing down, holding muscles tight. Neither is any part of the body slack. So the abdomen's not, right, sagging forward. I don't want to hold it in. I don't want to let it, right, sag. Just that tuck, right? If I can find it through a sense of relaxation and release, it turns the abdominal muscles on just a little bit. It gives me a very even quality, right? Back to front, or, including the sides, around that whole abdominal region. Within that gentle support, I can feel a sense of movement, maybe even circulation as the weight travels around. So if I do some basic walking, right? Again, this isn't even quite normal Tai Chi walking yet, right? This is applying the Tai Chi principles to something more like natural walking. But if I let go of that pelvic tilt for a minute and notice what that feels like, especially that relationship between the low back and the front of the abdomen. Do I feel like there's much communication there? Do I feel like there's, right, some clear balance, right? Is the muscle tension about the same in back and front? And by tension, I just mean a little tonus, a little firmness, right? Not what we usually mean by tension. And now if I drop the tailbone under, so forward from the hips a little bit, even if I walk more quickly, but again, this posture makes it pretty comfortable to walk quite slowly as well. Do I feel some difference in that front to back relationship up in the abdominal area? And how hard is it to maintain that posterior pelvic tilt? Posterior because it feels like the front hip bones here are rolling back a little bit as the tailbone rolls forward under the body. And that's why it's called posterior. Now, if I try to tense and hold it, the whole thing feels kind of stiff and wooden. I still might be able to walk fairly smoothly, right? But this area, right, starts to feel quite restricted. Amongst other things, it's going to make it very hard for me to drop my breath so I feel it in my abdomen. So there has to be some degree of relaxation. Feel like the breath flows freely down. So hopefully I feel a little bit more freedom, right? Some looseness in the back. And conversely, I may be feeling, right, a little bit more just automatic, natural support in the front of the abdomen. Unless I'm somebody who holds my abdomen tight all the time, in which case there also I want to be consciously relaxing a little bit, right? Using this posture, maybe release some of that excess tension. But a lot of people don't habitually hold their abdomen in. Plenty of people do. They were taught to do so often when they were young. So it's hard to give one size fits all advice because our habits are often quite different. Now, to get a little closer to what we would typically call Tai Chi walking, we have to introduce another range of motion. And so that is also right up in the hips. So if I put my hands on the hip bones, this movement's all going to be coming right from down at the hip crease where the thighs meet the trunk, which is below where my hands are sitting. Right? So it's right at the bottom of the hip bones where the actual hip joint is. And it's just going to be a little turn. So think of steering it with your belt buckle. Turning a little bit to one side and the other. So there's no twisting at the waist, right? I'm not leading with my shoulders or even my head. My head and shoulders are just going along for the ride. And one thing we want to notice is that if I let my backside stick out a little bit, again, if I let the curve come into my low back, and I do that same kind of turning, it might be a little harder to isolate the twist at the hip joint. It, right, it might be a little hard to keep it out of the waist. It also might be hard to keep it out of the ankle and even the knee. So dropping the tailbone under with a little bit of hip flexion may help me isolate the turn right here so that my ankle isn't moving and my knee isn't falling inward, that my knee is staying right over my foot. And again, I'm going to think as I turn to this side, on the opposite side, I'm going to be really thinking about releasing the weight down through that hip and leg to keep it firmly planted. Here, there's no weight shift, so I'm not rocking back and forth, just turning. I'm trying to keep my weight as even on my 2 feet as possible. Particularly on the outside of the foot I'm turning away from, right, toward the little toe, because that's where it's very easy to roll in. So now I'm using everything we've talked about in terms of posture to keep that back foot, especially the outside of that back foot, the little toe, anchored as I make the turn. Now, what happens if I add the weight shift there? I'm going to shift my weight just 70% and turn to that side. And when I think about how much I'm turning, we can use that same number, 70%. You sort of don't go to 100% of what you think you can do in terms of the turn, just to 70%. If you start going past that, you'll find it gets harder and harder to keep that back foot rooted, planted. You'll notice in this turning that as we turn, say I turn to this side, it feels like I'm folding my low abdomen at the lower belly in toward the thigh. It's emphasizing that crease, the same hip crease that I have right when I was doing a little bit of flexion earlier. On the other side, though, it's stretching it out. The thigh feels like it's moving away from the low abdomen. And so there's another yin-yang relationship, right? Opening versus closing. Yeah. Put the weight shift back in. It just makes it a bit more obvious still. So really just relaxing and releasing down through that hip, leg, the foot. And again, as I keep that back foot anchored, it keeps the heavy leg stable. It keeps, again, my hip right over my heel, my knee right over the instep or toes. And that's what keeps my knees from twisting from side to side. It's not, again, tensing my legs to try to hold them and resist that twist. It's feeling how to release the weight down so that it becomes naturally stable. So what would this mean if we went for a walk? So when we just walk naturally, so I'm just going to return to normal posture. We're not aware of the hips particularly turning from side to side. If I did let my hips turn side to side as I walked, it might be a little destabilizing, especially if I turn, right? If I'm thinking about it, I might think, oh, to put one foot forward, I turn the opposite way, right? Because turning this way sort of tends to put that leg forward. That ends up being a very strange walk, right? And not very balanced, right? It gets kind of lumbering and awkward very quick. There's a kind of hidden turn when we're walking, which is the opposite of that, which is as I step forward, instead of over relaxing, right, the hips and turning out to this side, I'm actually turning a little bit toward that front leg. It's extremely subtle. I don't even notice it, but it's actually what is keeping me straight. It's a kind of counter twist. On the Tai Chi posture, then I go a little slower. That counter twist becomes more obvious. As I'm taking a slow step, in fact, there might be even more of a tendency to turn out. So I have to, right, correct against that. So I'm turning to the front. And whenever we talk about these turns, it never involves the hip swaying out to the side. Right? If my hip sways out to the side, it becomes a very awkward kind of counterbalance. It's a kind of counterbalance, but again, it's going to get kind of awkward and lumbering or overly twisted. It's not going to be great for the alignment of this leg. So as I do this walking, my hip stays over the heel. And again, the turning is essentially invisible, right? The turning toward this foot actually just keeps the hips straight. So it risks being really too subtle to even notice. But again, if we're going slow, it's a little perhaps easier to feel, and we might start to notice the usefulness of it. Right? If we were to walk in place a little bit, the higher leg lift, I think it becomes more obvious. As we let that leg come up, it could easily sort of turn me out to the side, right? The other thing, the thing that perhaps happens more often is that as I lift that leg up, my hip swings out to the side. So in that case, there is that kind of turning to the front counterbalance, but it's not stable. So as I lift this leg, the hip has to stay right where it is, right over the heel. And thinking about keeping the hips facing forward as a kind of a turn, a kind of counter twist, can help me find the nice, straight, stable line of the standing leg. So today we threw in a lot of ideas. But it gets us a lot closer to what we would typically see as Tai Chi walking. Shake out the legs. And then again, we'll just go finish by just going for a walk. This time I'm going to do the Tai Chi walking first. Right? Again, something we can call Tai Chi walking. Right? Because we're more consciously activating the alignment principles. So chin back, crown up, finding that hip crease, but also dropping the tailbone under. And that helps give me that nice vertical relationship to the ground. Right? My weight is always aligned with gravity, moving straight down to that leg. I notice that I'm significantly tensing my abdominal muscles. I want to relax them. But if they feel slack and loose, maybe a little more emphasis on not tensing the abs, but dropping the tailbone under until I feel the support come on very lightly. Now, if I want to go back to just natural walking, a little less emphasis on that dropping the tailbone under, on that posterior tilt. But maybe still some if you find that it helps with the ease of the movement and the support. If you doubt that there's any kind of hip turning, that kind of twist going on in natural walking, you can ask yourself why your arms swing, right? Sometimes you see people who, when they're walking, their arms do not swing, even when they're not carrying anything. So my thoughts always go to why not? What's not happening to their body that their arms don't want to swing? Right, so where does the counterbalance come from? That's the opposite arm and leg that go forward. Well, we can look for part of that in this sort of secret turn of the hips that's invisible. It's invisible in terms of I don't see my hips turning left and right. It's not invisible in the sense that I see the effect of it. I see that counterbalance movement in the swing of the arms. So just in natural walking, you can see that what we've been talking about, right, is still applicable. All right. Thank you.